In the beginning, the internet was a miracle, a digital Wild West where information, money, knowledge, and culture could flow around the world with no limits. It promised us a future where technology would set humanity free. It promised a future where power would belong to the individual. But somewhere along the way, that dream was corrupted. As the internet grew to become ubiquitous, the open frontier closed, and the dream of freedom became a nightmare of surveillance, consumerism, advertising, and control.
The Trump administration has tapped Palantir, the data mining company, to compile data on people in the United States for a master database.
The same technology that we had hoped would liberate us began dividing, manipulating, and watching on a scale that was previously unimaginable.
We power ICE. We power efforts to defend America and Ukraine. We've supported Israel. I don't know all the efforts we're involved in, but I and most Palantirians are very proud of this.
As the world drives off a cliff faster than we can react, with crisis after crisis, increasingly violent politics, polarized culture, and a general sense that life is getting worse for almost everybody,
the government shutdown hitting 1 month this morning, leaving nearly 42 million Americans who rely on food benefits without enough to eat.
trillion-dollar tech companies fly past previously impossible milestones.
Elon Musk has officially become the richest person in the world.
It feels like myself and everybody I know is asking ourselves, how did this happen and what are we supposed to do? But there's one person in particular who saw it all coming. After he helped create revolutionary technology at the peak of the Silicon Valley boom, Peter Thiel would come to see democracy and humanity not as sacred, but as obstacles that he would have to destroy along the way to becoming far more powerful. This is the story of how the world got this way. This is the story of the man who owns it. This is the story of Peter Thiel. Peter Thiel was born in Germany, West Germany at the time, in Frankfurt in 1967, but his childhood wasn't the typical adolescent experience of a European kid growing up in the 70s. The official story that pops up everywhere you look on the internet is simple. Peter Thiel's father was a chemical engineer that relocated his family between a couple of different countries to further his career during the 60s and the 70s. But that's only part of the picture as we come to see how his family would shape his worldview, his ambitions, and his approach to power and business. Because when you look at where they relocated to, it becomes obvious that there was a deeper ideology behind their moves. Because West Germany in the late 1960s was finally rich, stable, and comfortable after embracing capitalism, democracy, and progress following the chaos and destruction of World War II. Not only were they growing faster than East Germany, but they had one of the strongest economies in Europe overall.
Tower of Radio Free Berlin. The view from the top is a favorite of Willy Brandt's. From up here, he can see the ultra-modern Congress Hall he hopes will one day house an all-German parliament.
And on the surface, they had it all together, but behind the scenes, things were falling apart existentially. Basically, even while they were trying to move on from their tragically blood-stained past, there were still former Nazis sitting in government positions, teaching in universities, and running corporations all over the country. And the younger generation who were born after the war were waking up to that reality with shame and disgust, feeling that older Germans were content to avoid the truth by ignoring the nasty past.
The scenes of violence in Berlin streets were ugly. They were echoed in other German cities as the students grouped into menacing armies. One of their aims was to stop the distribution of all Springer newspapers. Force was met with force.
More than politics or economics, it was a fight about what kind of country Germany would be in the future. Would they ignore their Nazi history and let it continue to exist under the surface? Or would they walk away from it for good? And unrest became outrage after a 26-year-old university student was shot in the back of the head by police during a protest. And so within a year, there would be a variety of demonstrations around the country that ultimately changed German culture forever. Countless professors, administrators, and politicians with Nazi pasts were pushed out of power, and in the end, the idea of never again became central to Germany's new identity as the next generation chose to follow a more modern, progressive path. But the Thiel family were not progressives. His father, Klaus Friedrich Thiel, was born in Germany in 1938, meaning that Peter Thiel's grandparents were adults during the Nazi Party's rise to power, and his family did not embrace the liberal wave of post-war Europe. Their answer to these problems would be to leave Germany forever. After a year spent in Cleveland, they would then move to Southwest Africa, a South African territory that later became the country of Namibia, where Klaus Thiel would help manage the development of the Rosing uranium mine. The Rosing mine is one of the mines that was used in South Africa's illegal weapons operation that sold the ingredients for nuclear weapons to countries like France, Israel, and China during a time when the international community was pushing hard to limit nuclear proliferation. But more important than the mine was the town itself. The Thiels would stay in Swakopmund, a town of 25,000 people that sits between the Atlantic Ocean and the vast Namib Desert. Not only were they living in South Africa during the violent era of apartheid, but despite its small size and isolated location, the town of Swakopmund itself was significant for many post-war Germans. And that's because it was one of the few places that ex-Nazis weren't just welcome, but were even celebrated. Swakopmund was settled in 1892 as the main harbor for German Southwest Africa, a colony that Germany controlled for just a few short decades before losing it during World War I, although it would remain a culturally German beach resort town, mainly because the southwest Namib Desert was impossibly far away from the rest of the world, surrounded by nothing but oceans of sand and 2 centuries worth of shipwrecks. And it was in this isolated, backwater environment that former Nazis felt free to be themselves, and not as a quiet minority or a fringe community. The story goes that in Swakopmund, it was common to greet others with Heil Hitler. A 1970s New York Times article would describe the town as more German than Germany, with streets named in German and Main Street shops dedicated entirely to goods imported from Germany. Even as late as 1989, the Nazi flag was flown from the tallest building in the town to mark the 100th anniversary of Hitler's birthday. And that's where Peter Thiel and his family lived until he was 11 years old. After a decade, when the mine was finished, the Thiels would move back to the US, where they would settle in the Bay Area of California in a suburb south of San Francisco. Peter Thiel's biographer paints his childhood in California as full of contradictions. During classmate interviews, former friends would call him joyless and vain at the same time. Because as a young teen, he was very much the archetypical 1980s nerd. If nothing else brought him happiness, Peter Thiel was downright obsessed with science fiction and fantasy, reading The Lord of the Rings over 10 times and naming Isaac Asimov as another favorite author. Naturally, Dungeons & Dragons was his favorite game to play, where he would often take the role of Dungeon Master, the director that controls the game's reality for other players. But despite that, he would, quote, never hide that he was intelligent. At 12 years old, he was one of the highest ranked young chess players in all of California, putting a sticker on his chess set that said "Born to Win," although in reality, he was known for losing his cool and getting angry when he did lose. But growing up in the 80s, he faced a lot of bullying for these interests, and by the time he entered the second half of high school, his classmates would notice that the bullying he had gone through didn't really affect him much, as his awkwardness became outright arrogance. One of his friends would later say, Peter never tried to hide the fact that he was the smartest guy in the room. One story comes from his senior year, where even after being accepted into Stanford, one of the top universities in the country, Thiel risked his entire college career by taking the SAT for underclassmen for $500 each, a side hustle that, while lucrative, could have also had him thrown out of college before he even got there. But anecdotes about Peter Thiel's personality would only get stranger as he started college at Stanford University, and his own unique worldview and ambitions began to take shape after a deeply unconventional childhood. Upon being accepted into Stanford University, Peter Thiel didn't follow the trend of going into computer science that was soon going to turn the entire Bay Area into the worldwide center of the technology boom. Instead, he chose to pursue a degree in philosophy. But it wasn't the education itself that would define his time at Stanford. Instead, we can look at it as the place where Peter Thiel's deep, lifelong relationship to politics and technology began. He's this kid that was raised in severely conservative German South Africa, and then he arrives at this progressive-leaning university in Northern California. After being raised by a father who was willing to move continents a half dozen times to avoid liberalism, and a childhood spent in a town that practically worshipped Nazis, and now he's walking right into the epicenter of 1980s progressivism. And the students at his school were some of the most empathetic, bleeding heart, politically extreme group of kids in modern history. But instead of being swept up into the rising tide of progressivism, Peter Thiel would find himself deeply at odds with the world around him. He would lean into his upbringing and heritage, doubling down and turning ideological confrontation into a cornerstone of who he was in a way that would last for the rest of his life.
Laws made white people officially superior, and the large black majority faced discrimination in every aspect of their lives. Living, doing business, or owning land in white areas was banned. There were separate public facilities, transport and schools. Interracial marriage was banned. Many had no right to citizenship and were regarded as aliens in major cities.
In the mid to late 1980s, the state of politics in South Africa was becoming a central concern on college campuses around the US. Increased media attention had created a level of student outrage that hadn't been seen since the Vietnam War, putting the spotlight on the institutionalized racial segregation, violence against black citizens, and massive economic inequality.
When conflict erupted in the 1980s, with anti-apartheid activists frequently shot at, beaten, or arrested.
Students held protests on campus all over the country in an attempt to compel institutions to stop doing business with South African companies for as long as the crimes against humanity continued. Protest leaders would declare, "We don't want our education financed by the blood of the South African people." At Columbia in New York, hundreds of students and even some professors would blockade an academic building for over 3 weeks before the university finally cut all ties from South African companies. Stanford itself was particularly consequential. Over 1,000 students would sit in at Stanford alone, and in the end, the university's administrators would threaten to sell off enough stock in Motorola that the company agreed to cease sales of electronics to South African military forces. In the same way that students had shifted national consciousness in West Germany 20-something years earlier, now American students were turning apartheid from something distant and easy to ignore into a moral crisis that forced universities and companies to face the truth. And in the end, their protesting meaningfully contributed to the country's government eventually being sanctioned by the Reagan administration, which itself ended up being a huge turning point against the South African regime.
Both the government and its opponents should begin a dialogue about constructing a political system that rests upon the consent of the governed, where the rights of majorities and minorities and individuals are protected by law.
It was here that Peter Thiel stood as a college student, having just begun his education at one of the most progressive and outspoken schools in the country, at a time when nearly everybody was united in drawing attention to a gross injustice happening across the world. But that gross injustice just happened to be the one that he spent his childhood not just benefiting from, but celebrating. And so in the company of his peers, Peter Thiel would become known for openly dismissing the anti-apartheid movement as overblown. During conversations with his fellow students, he would say that apartheid works, defending it as a good economic system, which ended up earning him various accusations of ignorance, arrogance, or just plain racism. But after his ideas were outright rejected by the people around him, he wouldn't stop there. In fact, 20-year-old Peter Thiel would only double down and embark on the journey that would define the rest of his life, beginning a career full of what I would call ideological entrepreneurialism. And so in 1987, when Peter Thiel was in his second year of Stanford's philosophy program, he co-founded a student publication called the Stanford Review. And the paper had one goal: to advocate for conservative ideas at his famously liberal university. But it wasn't just inspired by political debates between himself and the other undergraduates. In the late 80s, Stanford was going through a serious period of change. Looking to modernize their approach to the humanities, they replaced a Western culture course with a program called Culture, Ideas, and Values that, quote, focused on diversity and multiculturalism. It was also mandated that the new program would include more works by women or non-white authors, and that professors should be non-white as well. And so in response, Thiel's paper presented itself as an objective forum for rational debate, claiming to present alternative views on a wide range of current issues in the Stanford community. And in one early edition of the paper, we can see this immensely revealing mission statement. Whenever debates do take place within the Stanford community, they're too often confined to an emotional level. Name-calling, like "that's racist," "he's a communist," "you're a fascist," is the norm, even though it rarely leads anywhere. In the Stanford Review, we will confine ourselves to rational argumentation, which will hopefully lead to rational thought and rational solutions. The emotional type of debate, on the other hand, has had a dismal track record of polarizing views and provoking irresponsible solutions. With this paper coming all the way from the late 80s, almost 40 years ago, it's almost shocking how it feels like it was written at the height of today's culture wars. Politically correct versus politically incorrect, rightoids versus libtards. Basically, it was the highbrow version of a Ben Shapiro debate compilation. But it's important to remember that it went even deeper than Peter Thiel disagreeing with liberalism or being an arrogant undergrad. These grievances he laid out in the paper were personal. While he may have written that it was all for the sake of debating and considering all viewpoints and being rational, in reality, Peter Thiel very much knew what side of the debate he was on. It's the same tactic that's used by a lot of the debate personalities around today. Acting like your position comes from a desire to advocate for ideological diversity and rationality and free speech, that can be a powerful tool to give the feeling of neutrality to what is in reality a very, very biased position. When you read excerpts from Peter Thiel's writing at the time, you know exactly what I'm talking about. It's very, very recognizable to the same type of debate tactics that people use today.
The reason we have racial tensions in our society, the reason we have other kinds of tensions, is not because there is a problem with racism and other forms of oppression, but because people are looking for these things too much.
And so by founding his own paper, one that would go against the grain of everyone around him, he was able to build his own stage instead of being forced to conform to the dominant campus culture at the time. But for Peter Thiel, instead of just coming out of a desire to be contrarian to those he didn't align with, his disagreements were true to him. And that's because he grew up in South Africa in a culture that was essentially outside of the Western world. Thousands of miles away from Europe or North America, sandwiched between the barren desert and the vast ocean, progress or neoliberalism was not a concern for the people of Swakopmund. Peter Thiel's family raised him on an island of extreme conservatism, where you could openly praise Hitler and celebrate racial oppression with no pushback whatsoever. His contrarianism wasn't uninformed. It was, in fact, a reflection of his entire life so far. It just so happened that his writings were also a great early glimpse into the culture war that would later escape college campuses and define American social politics for the last decade and a half. After graduating from Stanford Law School in the early 90s, Peter Thiel spent a couple of years rapidly hopping between jobs around the world. By the time he had turned 30, he had been a clerk for a federal judge in Alabama, a securities lawyer at a multi-billion-dollar firm in New York City. He was then hired as a trader at a bank in Switzerland, and in the middle of all of that, he picked up experience writing speeches at the office of Reagan-era Education Secretary William Bennett. And while all of these were highly qualified jobs, they weren't exactly notable. And with Thiel not staying at any of them for more than a year, I'm guessing he probably knew that. And so at the age of 29, in 1996, Peter Thiel goes back to California, but this time he had a plan, because he was walking right into one of the most explosive moments in the history of business, the birth of the internet economy. And by the time Thiel had returned home in the late 90s, the Bay Area had become something entirely new. Startup culture was taking over as tech giants popped up out of nowhere. Venture capital was raising billions, millionaires were made overnight, and there was a general sense that just about everything in the world could be remade on the internet if you moved fast enough. And Northern California had become the center of this new digital frontier.
An enormous amount of venture capital pouring into Silicon Valley. I mean, in the tens of billions of dollars was being poured in, and frankly being distributed to anybody who could, raise their hand and say, yes, I think I have a clever business idea.
There was a part of me during the dot-com boom that was going, this seems really stupid, but it seems to be working. I mean, these guys are making a lot of money somehow. Maybe I just don't get it, right?
And so when he got back to California, he found Thiel Capital Management, raising around $1 million with help from friends and family, which should probably raise your eyebrow. And he turns it into his own little self-directed venture capital fund to capitalize on the internet economy boom. But again, he was a philosophy student with a law degree. He didn't study business, he didn't study computer science, and so his plan to capitalize on the internet economy was to create his own vehicle to invest into other people's ideas and hopefully turn a profit in a time when it seemed like just about anybody could start their own online company.
One is turning into millionaires overnight from stock options and IPOs, and it was just, it's kind of enticing when you're fresh out of college and you see all that stuff and all the magazines and everything. You're just like, that's the place I need to go.
But after a major investment into a friend's online calendar project collapsed almost immediately, Thiel was back at square one. But instead of going back to a career in law that it seemed like he was never particularly interested in to begin with, Peter Thiel started building his own company, with no idea that it would do far more than just make him rich, but actually fundamentally change how the world uses money. But first he went through even more failure. With the same set of friends from the last company, Peter Thiel co-founded Confinity, a company with an initial product that was convoluted and not really that relevant even back then. Basically, their software allowed users to send money between Palm Pilot devices, pocket-sized touchscreen computers that were popular at the time and could be used to take notes, save contact info and calendar events, and other administrative tasks. And being able to beam money between these devices was an interesting concept, but in practice, it was somewhat of an awkward failure. Palm Pilots, while popular with the tech yuppie crowd, weren't really widely adopted by ordinary people. There were only around 5 million devices in circulation at the time, and that was a pretty low ceiling on how popular something like PayPal could become. On top of that, though, it was pretty clunky. Early team members would later say that as far as actually using the app was concerned, no one could really think of anything to do with it besides splitting the tab after dinner.
When we started PayPal, the initial product was an infrared beaming device on Palm Pilots for sending money. It was voted one of the 10 worst business ideas in 1999, and 1999 was a year where there were many bad ideas in technology.
But they would quickly realize that despite their lack of success, they had unintentionally built technology that could be easily applied elsewhere. In the mid to late 90s, being able to conveniently and safely make online purchases was extremely difficult. If you wanted to buy something on the computer, you would either write a check and mail it, which could take weeks to clear and was subject to fraud on both sides. It was an option to type your credit card information directly into an unsecured form on a merchant's website, but you'd have to trust they wouldn't overcharge you or just end up stealing it. Or you could use software like Cybercash or eGold, which were incredibly primitive and hard to get into for most users. Essentially, there was no real way for ordinary people to make online purchases, even while websites like eBay and Amazon were becoming incredibly popular. And this lack of convenience was a huge barrier towards further growth. Sending money orders in the mail to buy something on Amazon wasn't going to work anymore if the internet wanted to see widespread adoption. It was going to have to be easy, convenient, and safe. And so Peter Thiel and his team set out to apply their Palm Pilot technology, then called PayPal, to the entire internet. Along the way, they would merge with Elon Musk's X.com, a popular online banking and money transfer app, and they would combine technologies, creating one website where anyone in the world with an email address and access to a computer could send or receive money online. And even though they launched right before the collapse of the dot-com bubble that was so bad it took the American stock market years to recover from,
after what they are already calling Black Friday, they are counting up the damage on Wall Street tonight.
In the spring of 2000, the stampede reversed.
And sent the Dow and the NASDAQ plummeting. It was the worst single-day point loss ever for both exchanges.
Some person or some groups of people, and I think it was mainly the large institutional investors, stood up and said, no, I'm not putting another $100 million in this company because you've not made any progress to getting profitable.
PayPal only kept growing. With a viral marketing trick where they would offer $10 for every new user to try out the service, they went from tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands to millions of users in just 18 months. They had, against all odds, become one of the fastest growing online companies, with almost 200 employees and $100 million in revenue. Even the press couldn't deny that their success was exceptional. They would write, "E-currencies have rarely been worth the paper that they're not printed on." But with a potent viral marketing gimmick and a dose of dumb luck, PayPal is making person-to-person transactions pay. And so in 2002, they were ultimately acquired by eBay, one of their biggest partners, for whom they had made online checkouts possible for $1.5 billion. But the story goes that many of PayPal's original founding employees had a hard time adjusting to the more traditional corporate culture at their new parent company, and it would only be 1 or 2 years before almost every single one of them had walked away. Although that wasn't the end of the story, because the team that had built PayPal would go on to have possibly the most wide-ranging collective success story in the history of Silicon Valley. Max Levchin, one of PayPal's co-founders, would found Affirm, the company that initially popularized buy now, pay later services online. Elon Musk obviously became the wealthiest man on earth. Reid Hoffman, PayPal's former executive vice president, would found LinkedIn. Several former PayPal engineers and designers would form the team that founded YouTube and sold it to Google for billions of dollars. Another software developer from PayPal would co-found Yelp. Another one would later work as the CEO of Reddit. And that's only a few examples. Basically, the percentage of early PayPal employees that would later become highly influential serial entrepreneurs was high.
And part of what was interesting in these companies was that the diversity of all of them, like none of the content is exactly the same. If you look at this, LinkedIn is about kind of professional networking, YouTube is about video, Tesla electronic cars, SpaceX launches spaceships, Yammer, which is business communication.
And their success rate was even higher. Some of the biggest internet companies around today came out of this one small group.
This is PayPal today, which is a global company. It's a unicorn, before the term unicorn, and it is spitting out of eBay later this year. But the more interesting story is about what is called the PayPal Mafia, which is the group of people behind this. And more value was created after the essentially after PayPal than was in the initial period. And so
but Peter Thiel wouldn't found any other companies at all, because tech itself wasn't the full story of what he was trying to do. Even in early interviews during their first initial growth spurt, he would speak candidly with journalists about how he envisioned PayPal's political purpose. Thiel believes his company could ultimately compete with titans like American Express, but the prize he has in mind is bigger than a place in the Dow. He hopes to make PayPal a vehicle of geopolitical liberation. The ability to move money fluidly and the erosion of the nation-state are closely related, he explains. With a PayPal account, anyone on the internet can transfer value with greater anonymity than they could with a Swiss bank account. Hard to tax, harder to regulate, and nearly impossible to control. In other words, PayPal was crypto before crypto existed, a libertarian dream of money without government oversight.
And that's the kind of choice governments like China, India, some of these other countries are going to face. They will either have to shut down the telecommunications network and make it illegal for you to own a cell phone, or they will have to basically give up the kind of monetary sovereignty they've had and the enormous power that they've been able to wield as a result of this kind of sovereignty over the last many, many years.
And so by all accounts, Peter Thiel had not set out to be a CEO. Everything he had worked on to that point, even his billion-dollar tech company, had been ideologically motivated. And so instead of going off to found another tech company and chase after the next billion-dollar product like all of his friends from PayPal had, Peter Thiel would instead double down on what he believed in and go in a completely different direction, seeking to build a new level of influence and control bigger than any widget or app that he could help develop. PayPal was a revolutionary product, one of the biggest tech companies of its entire generation. And it wasn't just that they had gotten lucky during a moment of growth in tech, they had legitimately revolutionized the use of money online. But on Peter Thiel's resume, it was an outlier. He was a philosophy student who ran a paper at school. He was into politics and debates, culture wars, and his work experience was as a lawyer. Developing software, managing a huge team, being the figurehead of a tech company, that never really seemed like it was part of his plan. So even in a moment where the entire world would have jumped to invest in Peter Thiel's companies, he simply walks away. But he didn't disappear. Instead, he was actually going to go bigger, focusing his energy on bringing his philosophies to life across the entire tech industry. In the early to mid-2000s, Peter Thiel founded a long list of venture capital firms. Clarium Capital was first, a hedge fund that he founded almost immediately after PayPal was sold. And while it was successful, his investing career didn't really kick off until he became the first outside investor in Facebook, buying 10% of the company for $500,000 in 2004, at a time when the platform had less than 100,000 users. Then the year after that, while his shares in Facebook were well on their way to being worth tens of millions of dollars, he opens Founders Fund, a venture capital firm that would quickly reach a portfolio worth $20 billion by making early investments in SpaceX, Airbnb, DeepMind, Spotify, Stripe, Neuralink, OpenAI, Figma, Affirm, Polymarket, Credit Karma, Lyft, Wish, and many other massive companies. In 2008, he would invest in the Seasteading Institute, a company founded by Milton Friedman's grandson that aimed to create permanent, autonomous ocean cities that could exist without interference from any government entity. In 2011, he founded Breakout Ventures, another VC firm, this time for the purpose of investing in biotechnology. And ultimately, almost all of Peter Thiel's investments pointed towards one vision of what technology could do for civilization: expanding freedom, putting power in the hands of people, connecting the world beyond the barriers of banks, languages, government, and nationality. As the first investor in Facebook, he helped build a platform that wasn't just a social network, but a digital ecosystem that redefined how humanity could communicate and do business across the world. And then, being the first institutional investor in SpaceX, he showed that ambitious space exploration, which was once the exclusive domain of entire governments, could be achieved through private enterprise and entrepreneurial vision. Even more of his investments, companies like Airbnb, Spotify, and Lyft, they were, at their core, telling a story of decentralizing things like hotels, the music industry, taxis. He was dissolving old institutions into digital platforms and creating freedom by allowing direct digital connections. And again, this was at its core who Peter Thiel had always been. He starts out as a student of philosophy, someone obsessed with ideas and debates. His college project wasn't an app or a device or a website, it was a newspaper. And so in a time when technology was becoming the new frontier of humanity, Peter Thiel became the philosopher king, someone who never stopped asking, how do we innovate faster and build towards a better future as quickly as possible?
Companies. You're trying to do things with self-driving cars and supposedly with asteroid mining, although maybe that's just part of the propaganda ministry. And you're doing more than Microsoft or Apple or a lot of these other companies. Amazon's the only one, in my mind, of the big tech companies that's actually reinvesting all its money, that has enough of a vision of the future that they're actually able to reinvest all their profits.
They make less profit than Google does.
But if we're living in an accelerating technological world, and you have 0% interest rates in the background, you should be able to invest all of your money in things that will return it many times over. And the fact that you're out of ideas, maybe it's a political problem, the government's outlawed things, but
But even though Peter Thiel had built this crazy reputation as the libertarian technology philosopher, building a more free future through the internet, something completely different was forming underneath his idealism. Because despite everything he seemed to be trying to create, it would quickly become apparent that what he had actually made was something else entirely. On On September 11, 2001, the world changed forever when Al-Qaeda flew 2 Boeing 767s into the World Trade Center, killing almost 3,000 people in the deadliest terror attack in history. For people who are old enough to remember, they talk about airport checkpoints getting stricter and the general mood of the era, but more than that, it was a moment of fundamental change. The government put together the Department of Homeland Security, they passed the Patriot Act. It was the dawn of mass surveillance billed as security. Because the problem wasn't that they had no idea the attacks were coming. Instead, the legacy of America's response to 9/11 was one of uncoordinated incompetence. Prior to the attacks, multiple hijackers who were involved in 9/11 were known to the CIA, but were never placed on any watch list. Even 5 or 6 years before 9/11 happened, intelligence agencies knew that terrorists had plans to use airplanes as weapons, but had never specifically planned on how to prevent that happening. Basically, the fact that 9/11 happened at all was a deep institutional failure, and Americans knew this. But one thing that Peter Thiel had always been good at was spotting opportunities. And what he would realize was that the threat of terrorism in America connected directly to what he and his team had built at PayPal. Because really, for the first time ever, it was a tech startup processing oceans of data from all over the world. I mean, more than any one bank, more than any group individually, PayPal could see everything that anyone was doing on their platform. And at the same time, as they grew naturally, they had to start preventing financial crimes and fraud on the platform. To do that, they had to build highly sophisticated algorithms that could reach far and wide and detect patterns to prevent fraud. And so when the whole country realizes that 9/11 probably could have been prevented, Peter Thiel realizes that he may have already built the tech to do it. Thiel brings in Alex Karp to lead the company as CEO, another non-technical philosopher who had degrees in social theory and worked in tech-adjacent fields. And he would later say, about their early years, we couldn't, for the life of us, get any venture capitalist in California to invest in Palantir. The story goes that Michael Moritz, the head of gigantic venture capital firm Sequoia, would doodle through an entire meeting, and one of his colleagues would lecture the Palantir team about how the company was undoubtedly going to fail. Eventually, Peter Thiel himself had to put $30 million of his own money in to get Palantir off the ground. But even years later, after they had been developing the product for 6 or 7 years, journalists in the early 2010s would still write that no one seemed to know what exactly Palantir does. And so it remained as this kind of quiet project in the background, while Peter Thiel's much more prolific investing career brought him into the upper echelon of Silicon Valley. By 2012, the company's revenue had passed $300 million, and Peter Thiel would go on record saying that one day soon, Palantir will be as big as Facebook. But still, people didn't exactly know what the company did. In 2015, right around the time that their valuation was about to pass $20 billion in total, TechCrunch published a leaked report that actually gave the public the first big insight into what Palantir really was. Basically, they parse data for huge organizations, like an organization so big that they have petabytes of information and such a wide range of different kinds of data that there's basically no way for one team or one person to make sense of all of it. Essentially, Palantir is a solution that makes it extremely easy to search for, visualize, and process huge amounts of information. For example, Palantir helped the SEC convict Bernie Madoff, the New York banker whose Ponzi scheme was worth almost $70 billion in the late 2000s, by making it easy for them to search through 40 years of records and over 20 terabytes of data to build a case against him.
Bernie Madoff said he had no excuses before a federal judge sentenced him to 150 years for masterminding the biggest Ponzi scheme in world history.
Palantir explains that it's a tool set for use in human analysis on its website, and we now understand that the service is pretty much a smarter way of displaying data for analysis by humans. It's capable of building comprehensive models of activity to detect suspicious anomalies, and it's even able to provide immunity to fraud thanks to strategies the founders learned while still at PayPal. Palantir's anti-fraud system uses algorithms to detect and isolate patterns designated by analysts. This approach was inspired by the need to combat adaptive threats at PayPal. At the same time, though, that wasn't all it could be used for. One of their big clients was the LAPD, who was using Palantir as a tool for predictive policing, using the software to track and connect potential suspects all around the city and helping police officers prioritize which neighborhoods to patrol more than others. Starting in 2012, it was also used by the New Orleans Police Department, who secretly relied on Palantir to map gang networks and predict who might commit violence before it happened. The program scraped arrest records, social media, and police reports to flag specific individual residents of the city as higher risk. But at the same time, lawyers would later argue that criminal defendant rights had been violated by keeping the use of such software a secret from the community. Samuel Redding, former Marine who works in Afghanistan for the NEK Advanced Securities Group, was quoted in a document as saying that Palantir is the combination of every analytical tool that could ever exist. He said, "You will know every single bad guy in your area." Even New York City's police department secretly licensed Palantir for years, using it to connect arrest records, license plate data, and other information to connect crimes and people. TechCrunch's article also revealed that as of 2013, Palantir was in use by at least 12 groups within the US government, including the CIA, the NSA, the FBI. Every three-letter agency you could think of was using their software to turn oceans of data into easily digestible information that made spying and law enforcement easier and more accurate. It all sounds like something that would horrify Peter Thiel, but Peter Thiel was no longer the same person he used to be, and we can see the exact moment he changed. In the early 2000s, Peter Thiel wrote an essay called The Straussian Moment as a holistic overview of his general perspectives right around the time when Palantir was starting to get its first big contracts and the world in general was changing fundamentally with regards to almost everything. Economically, militarily, for better or for worse, this was a pretty important moment. And what he wrote was that America's constitutional system, the rules of our democracy itself, have become a barrier to progress, saying that the checks and balances meant to protect freedom now prevent any direct path forward. And so in this moment of instability, terror attacks, and wars, instead of reforming the system, Peter Thiel proposes something far darker: replacing it. He wrote that instead of a United Nations filled with interminable and inconclusive parliamentary debates that resemble Shakespearean tales told by idiots, we should consider Echelon, the secret coordination of the world's intelligence services, as the decisive path to a truly global Pax Americana. Basically, Peter Thiel is saying that democracy is too inefficient to save civilization from the existential threats outside, and that real order and progress will have to come from a new kind of power, a power that operates outside the restrictions of government. And so for him, the future didn't look libertarian or even democratic at all. It's technocratic, elite, and hidden. A world ruled not by votes, but by data, surveillance, and the people who control it. And judging by what he was doing with Palantir, and the way that it was a very clear contradiction compared to the rest of his career up till this point, it seems pretty clear that Peter Thiel's idea of what the world should look like had changed fundamentally. And so the Straussian moment wasn't just an essay. It was a roadmap. The same way that he had invested in tech with a philosophical point of view in the years prior, now he was going to do the same, but with a fundamentally different vision than before. With Palantir, Peter Thiel wasn't just imagining a world of surveillance and power, he was building it. And what happened next was going to solidify nearly every idea he had already been playing around with in his head. But he also wasn't alone. Peter Thiel wasn't the only person who saw new opportunities and ideas taking shape as the age of surveillance dawned in the 2000s and the world pretty clearly changed forever. A small but influential movement was quickly gaining clout on the internet with a series of ideas that attempted to explain a possibly more effective replacement for not just libertarianism, but American democracy in general. In their post-libertarian vision, freedom was no longer the goal of all goals. In fact, it would be almost the exact opposite. It all starts with Curtis Yarvin. Just a couple years younger than Thiel, he graduated from Brown University in 1992 and began a career in software development in Silicon Valley shortly after that. But in 2007, he began publishing essays on a personal blog under the anonymous name Mencius Moldbug, laying out a political philosophy called formalism that he saw as a potential replacement for all of the failings of the neoliberal order that dominates the Western world. Yarvin's writings relentlessly criticized liberal democracy, egalitarianism, and the notion of progress in general as detrimental to the advancement of society. He felt that civilization was being run into the ground by an amalgamation of universities and media companies called the Cathedral, who constantly preach a meaningless message of progress to the public while society decays over time. He described democracy as chaos and tyranny in the sense that if people don't actually know what's for the greater good and are being misled by the media, they may actually vote against meaningfully improving the world without knowing. And so Yarvin would essentially suggest that the values that had been passed down since the founding of America, individual liberty, constitutional government, progress, and human rights, had run their course and were no longer stable or useful. Instead, he would suggest a political system that combined corporatism with medieval feudalism, where a country could be run by a national CEO, a role that he described as a tech genius king, someone who had no limits on their authority and could ensure maximum growth and forward momentum for the country.
A monarch, a single focus of authority is, absolutely necessary to run any integrated system efficiently. You could probably put any of the Fortune 500 CEOs in and say, okay, you're in charge of the executive branch, fix this. They'd probably do fine. They wouldn't be Hitler or Stalin.
In a time plagued by economic instability and seemingly endless war as Bush's neoliberal America transitioned to Obama's neoliberal America, Curtis Yarvin quickly built a small but dedicated audience of disaffected, unsatisfied libertarians, technologists, and rationalists who all felt similarly that politics was crumbling under its own weight and a better solution was necessary to push towards the future.
Pretty far out in a way that is worth thinking about.
There's this guy Curtis Yarvin who's written about some of these things.
Are there people in the administration who are on signal groups with me? Yes, there are.
It only grew from there. Not everyone necessarily agreed with his calling for a total upending of civilization by replacing the government with a king, but there were a lot of people in the tech subculture who agreed that there was something wrong with the ineffective neoliberal status quo.
For years, Curtis Yarvin had been writing online about political theory and relative obscurity. His ideas were pretty extreme, that institutions at the heart of American intellectual life, like the mainstream media and academia, need to be dissolved. He also believes that government bureaucracy should be radically gutted, and that American democracy should be replaced by what he calls a monarchy run by a CEO.
Monarch is good, it's a neutral term.
Then came Nick Land. Land had been known as a provocative philosopher in the 1990s before disappearing into obscurity in China while struggling with a drug addiction. But in late 2012, he returned with a series of essays called The Dark Enlightenment, intending to build on Curtis Yarvin's ideas a few years earlier. He would talk even more about the idea of capitalism as a basis for society itself, instead of the long-held ideals like progress, liberty, or humanism. Nick Land would also argue in favor of authoritarian governance, which he thought could provide greater stability, order, and growth than modern liberal democracy. Like Yarvin, he would write that democracy was fundamentally destined for tyranny and that modern progressive ideas had morphed into a secular religion of its own, worshipped by a howling, irrational mob of people while politicians pander as society races towards the bottom. His answer was simple. Build an ultra-capitalist corporate medieval kingdom. Yes, an ultra-capitalist neo-feudal order. Nick Land literally wrote that society needs to return to the medieval era in an ultra-capitalist landscape ruled by an advanced technology with corporate principles. Curtis Yarvin envisioned it, and Nick Land turned it into a serious intellectual statement. But that wasn't all they had in common. They were both also racist. Curtis Yarvin had written that certain races are more naturally inclined towards slavery than others, while Nick Land has written repeatedly about the importance of racial hierarchies.
I don't necessarily believe then that certain races would be better at governing a country than others.
Again, governing a country is just a skill. And, it's like the British in India would basically say, oh, this race is a governing race, this race is not a governing race, based on culture, based on tradition, based on biology.
So you're saying, yes, certain races would be better at running governments than others.
Would be better at doing anything. But
the one thing they didn't have was someone to make their dark vision of the future come true. And yeah, again, their writing was offensive and extreme, but it had come at a moment when extreme ideas felt needed. After 2 wars, financial crash that never ended, and institutions lying straight to people's faces, saying tear it down and crown a CEO was at least worth thinking about to a lot of people. The Dark Enlightenment provided a dramatic answer to the disillusionment of the age, arguing that the only way forward was paradoxically to go back to older forms of authority, albeit augmented by modern technology and knowledge. And for Peter Thiel, after spending his whole career trying to innovate technology that could free the world, and now being frustrated and disappointed at the direction that politics, culture, and capitalism was going, these blogs felt like something designed in a lab to personally appeal to him. Curtis Yarvin and Nick Land had created the perfect blueprint to give Peter Thiel's multi-billion-dollar empire of philosophical technology a brand new purpose. He would become obsessed, investing in Curtis Yarvin's software projects and even writing his own essays building on their ideas. And the way that it manifested into his business empire was more extreme than anything he had done before. Because right after, literally months after the Curtis Yarvin-esque blog started gaining traction, came the worst recession since the Great Depression.
Collapsed, the mortgages couldn't be paid, and the banks essentially became insolvent.
The collapse of Bear Stearns was catastrophic. It was a wake-up call to Wall Street. That was a real tell in the unfolding and the house of cards coming crumbling down.
Gigantic banks failed, middle-class families watched their savings vanish, homes were lost, and jobs disappeared.
I think this is the most significant financial crisis in the post-war period.
There are fears the sell-off will continue on Wall Street.
Soaring gas prices, falling home prices, and rising unemployment.
It was a moment that broke Peter Thiel's belief system, when the world's biggest free market, the thing that he believed in more than anything, crashed and had to be saved by the government.
On the second try, the House passes a sprawling $700 billion government rescue of the financial industry, sending it to the president, who will sign it into law.
And yeah, I feel like me and you were 8 years old when this happened. You might not remember how big of a deal that was, but when researchers looked back at 2008, they found that there were more than 10,000 extra suicides than the average should have been during the height of the global financial crisis. It was enough to make Peter Thiel's libertarian dreams die. But in Peter Thiel's eyes, the worst part of it all was something else. The fact that the government had used $500 billion of taxpayer money to bail out the same banks that had caused the problem in the first place.
Some of the largest lenders in America had made bad loans, bundled them into securities that were virtually worthless, insured them with companies that couldn't stand behind the insurance. And in the end, the federal government had bailed them out because we need these big banks to keep the economy going.
For Peter Thiel, he wasn't just upset about irresponsible government spending. Instead, he was questioning everything he had dedicated his life to so far. For someone who spent his whole life worrying about innovation and technological progress, this type of government action may as well have been the end of the world. And so in 2009, Thiel writes a short essay called The Education of a Libertarian, where he says that in spite of all the success he's experienced over the last 10 years building companies and investing with a libertarian goal, he no longer believes that his libertarian beliefs are going to be of much consequence at all. As an entrepreneur and investor, I have focused my efforts on the internet. In the late 1990s, the founding vision of PayPal centered on the creation of a new world currency, free from all government control. By starting a new internet business, an entrepreneur can create a new world. The hope of the internet is that these new worlds will impact and force change on the existing social and political order. And I'll be honest, I get where Peter Thiel was coming from at this point in time. By the late 2000s or early 2010s, the political order had become pretty hollow. America was promised global cooperation, endless growth, free markets, but all we got was global terror, endless war, and failing markets, and neither political party had a solid plan on what to do, if they would even acknowledge the problem at all. American politics was starting to feel like a stagnant, dying system that was allowing the country to fall apart while the citizens suffered. But the solution Peter Thiel came up with was a whole other problem. But I must confess that over the last 2 decades, I have changed radically on the question of how to achieve these goals. Most importantly, I no longer believe that freedom and democracy are compatible. Basically, Peter Thiel was starting to feel like he had done as much as he possibly could for the libertarian goal of freedom, and for the rest of it, the democratic system was starting to get in his way. And honestly, a lot of this article is kind of incoherent, but there's one section in particular that really reveals what Peter Thiel was thinking at the time. It says, since 1920, the vast increase in welfare beneficiaries and the extension of the franchise to women, 2 constituencies that are notoriously tough for libertarians, have rendered the notion of capitalist democracy into an oxymoron. Essentially, he's writing that capitalism is not popular with the average person, the crowds, so to speak, and so as democracy grows, capitalists will only be more restricted and regulated. The more people who vote, the more likely it is that wealth redistribution will grow as well. As a libertarian capitalist, that's not the world Peter Thiel wants to live in. Basically, democracy and the concerns of the masses is constraining his ability, his liberty and freedom to build the future of entrepreneurship and capitalism. And so his answer is that he writes, the fate of our world may depend on the effort of a single person who builds or propagates the machinery of freedom to make the world safe for capitalism. And I kind of get what he was saying, at least up until this point. I think we all understand that our political system today is corrupt, it's inefficient, and doesn't really serve people. And in a lot of ways, we aren't actually free. But where Peter Thiel deviates is that when he realized he couldn't make the world more free, his first thought was at least he could be the one in control. I mean, this literally says the fate of the world might depend on a single person who builds the machinery of freedom to make the world safe for capitalism. And so after years of trying to create freedom by building tech, Peter Thiel felt pretty defeated. And understandably so. PayPal never became the libertarian dream it was meant to be because of regulation and laws. Terror attacks had brought about an increase in surveillance over private citizens, and then a huge recession increased government spending and taxes and regulation more than ever before. But this is also where Palantir finally finds its purpose, to help Peter Thiel grab power and control. Because if the systems weren't going to function, at least he could be the one behind the wheel. But Palantir was only one small piece of the puzzle. Throughout the 2010s, Peter Thiel's investment career in general took a pretty sharp turn. Thiel's Founders Fund would also invest $1 billion, the biggest investment they had ever made in Anduril Industries, a company making AI-powered surveillance towers for border protection and military use, among other futuristic defense technology. He would also invest in and join the board of multiple European startups focused on attack drones and remote warfare. When Peter Thiel wrote in 2009 that we are in a deadly race between politics and technology, I don't think him going and becoming a merchant of death is what most people would have expected. But sure enough, he had slowly transitioned from investing in apps for banking and social media and instead turned towards weapons of war and surveillance, doing business not with international customers searching for freedom via the internet, but instead, his client was now the government, the very same government that he had once sought to build an escape ladder away from. And so when you combine all this together, you're looking at a pretty different person than who Peter Thiel used to be. His work was no longer about expanding people's collective liberties as much as possible. Instead now, by investing in weapons, surveillance, and war, he's only making the government stronger. Freedom for all was openly no longer the end goal. Now, it was about protecting the very same institutions he had once dreamed of getting rid of. Today, it's the end of 2025, and Palantir's value has skyrocketed, with the company now being worth well over $400 billion. At the same time, though, the company is more heavily criticized than it ever has been. Even more than enabling potentially questionable police tactics in American cities, Palantir has reached a sky-high valuation by achieving widespread adoption around the world. Within the US federal government, it holds contracts with every branch of the military and every single three-letter security agency: the FBI, CIA, DHS, the Marines, the Air Force. All of these departments are now relying on Palantir to more accurately spy on their targets. And reporting from leaked NSA documents revealed that Palantir software is also now used to sift through massive amounts of X keyscore data, essentially being able to track almost everything that typical users do on the internet. One UK intelligence review warned that Palantir able to view the world's internet traffic completely at will. In Israel, Palantir controversially partnered with the IDF to use AI targeting for adversaries, although the accuracy of their work was highly questioned after over 200 aid workers were killed in Gaza in just a few months in 2024.
So what do you think about the use of artificial intelligence, or lavender, by the IDF in identifying Hamas targets?
Look, I'm not, without going into all the I'm not on top of all the details of what's going on in Israel because my bias is to defer to Israel.
Law advocates in the UK have written that Palantir is able to create a 360 profile of individuals and carry out indiscriminate mass surveillance. Most recently, in 2024, they pitched creating an initiative that would link IRS, Social Security, and visa data all in one system, creating a massive database of information about the American people that could be accessed at will by any federal agency. Today, Palantir is also being used in the US to help ICE carry out deportations with a software platform called Immigration OS that tracks immigrants. But whatever it's being used for, the end result is that Palantir is essentially a privatized intelligence agency. And when you combine the size of all the agencies they partner with, they're probably the most powerful one in the world alone. Working with nearly every government agency you could imagine, Palantir's tools give power to cops, spies, and the military to, yes, predict danger, but behind the scenes, they're slowly shifting away the power of surveillance into completely private hands with no democratic control over who gets flagged or why, or how to fight back. This type of surveillance is a violation of personal liberty by almost any definition you could think of. It goes against almost every value we've come to expect and understand as Americans. Palantir is literally a magic crystal ball watching all of us all the time, and it was created by Peter Thiel. And part of the reason why it got that big at all is because 10 years ago, Peter Thiel bought the President of the United States. On July 21st, 2016, Peter Thiel took the stage at the Republican National Convention in Cleveland and said,
"I am proud to be gay. I am proud to be a Republican. But most of all, I am proud to be an American."
He would follow it up by saying, "Nobody in this race is honest except Donald Trump," a statement that was followed by thunderous applause, and from him, a smirk. Peter Thiel had obviously, up until this moment, spent his political energy almost exclusively on futile libertarian causes, as a big donor to Ron Paul in 2008 and 2012.
More than $2.5 million to Ron Paul. Is that not, I mean, in practical terms, just flushing money down the drain?
Well, it's flushing money down the drain if you're hoping to to achieve power. I think it's an investment in the future. I think the future of this country will be more libertarian.
But Donald Trump was not a libertarian. Trump's promise was something else entirely. His politics were built on a feverish populism that promised rebellion against the elites, a return to greatness across the nation, and a new era of prosperity for all, especially the downtrodden working class that felt abandoned and disenfranchised after the promised recovery from the 2008 financial crisis never came. Trump's Democratic opponent, Hillary Clinton, came off as profoundly fake and impersonal, another sordid reminder of the corrupt political machine spewing the same old bullshit.
Pokemon go to the polls.
Trump himself, though, was electric.
Awfully good that someone with the temperament of Donald Trump is not in charge of the law in our country.
Because you'd be in jail.
Because when someone showed up promising to smash the machine, it didn't matter who it was. It sounded like the first honest sentence that had been uttered in a century.
I had a lot of people, and one guy who was seriously obese. He complained when I mentioned that food stamps, we have a lot of people on food stamps. And the guy went crazy. And they said that wasn't politically correct. Who cares? We all have a weight problem.
But when it came to the vast majority of people in tech, Trump was extremely unpopular because he wasn't just raw. Millions of people saw him as downright disgusting. His campaign was built on controversy, insults, scandals, threats.
This guy, I don't know what I said. I don't remember. He's going like, I don't remember. Maybe that's what I said.
In an attitude considered by many to be downright disrespectful to the office of the presidency, even by fellow Republicans.
Donald Trump's candidacy is a cancer on conservatism.
What about Marco Rubio?
I think he's highly overrated.
I don't think that the way he's behaved over the last few weeks is either dignified or worthy of the office that he seeks.
And by the way, I have much better hair than he does, okay?
In April of 2016, Mark Zuckerberg gave a speech condemning politicians calling for the building of walls.
I hear fearful voices calling for building walls and for slowing immigration. Instead of building walls, build bridges. And instead of dividing people, we can help bring people together.
Tim Cook notably declined to support the 2016 RNC. Elon Musk went on record saying that Trump was probably not the right guy, while Jeff Bezos openly said he seemed unfit for office.
A year ago, you blogged that you didn't have very strong feelings about the election, but that you hoped Trump would not get the nomination. Do you essentially feel the same way about his victory to the White House?
Well, I feel a bit stronger that probably he's not the right guy. He just doesn't seem. He doesn't seem to have the sort of character that reflects well in the United States. It's just I don't know. No.
Peter Thiel endorsing Donald Trump was so controversial that there was actually a call for him to be removed from the board at Facebook because of his political views. But the question that keeps coming back is why? What made Peter Thiel go down this road and become someone else entirely? Why are his investments, his companies, and his beliefs unrecognizable from what they were 25 years ago? How did he drift so far from these goals of personal freedom and individual liberty? And what is he even trying to achieve? But again, he wasn't just doing it to do it. His contrarianism, as always, had a motive. In 2011, Peter Thiel had said in an interview that the world's mood of emergency following the financial crisis had him feeling hopeful. He said that the failure of the establishment was too obvious to ignore, and an opportunity for something completely new to take over was growing. And so after Peter Thiel steps out on the stage to endorse Donald Trump at the RNC, it didn't take long for the media to put a couple pieces together and realize that Peter Thiel may not necessarily be a fan of Donald Trump at all, but rather he maybe saw his feverish and fanatical style as a possible means to an end. And so when you combine that with his writings that he believed democracy should be replaced with a system friendlier to capitalism, it became kind of easy to see how Peter Thiel probably wasn't that concerned with Trump's promise to bring coal back to Western Pennsylvania. Maybe more so he was hoping that Trump might help achieve his openly stated goal of shrinking democracy to make more room for capitalism. Trump was a candidate known for racist tirades, a candidate that promised to increase deportations, to act with hostility towards the democratic masses that Peter Thiel had long expressed maybe need to be thrown to the side so he can make more money. Even back in 2016, there are articles you can find where people were starting to connect the dots between Peter Thiel's newfound appreciation for the Republican Party and his statements about the end of democracy. Trump gives Peter Thiel a way to fulfill his long-held ambition of saving capitalism from democracy. And Peter Thiel's preferred political future isn't hard to picture. The government shoulders the research costs for capitalists, but makes no demands and sets no conditions. An authoritarian leader uses racial anger to set one portion of the population against another and cracks down on those he sees as alien or illegitimate. The state becomes even more responsive to the needs of capitalists and even less responsive to the needs of workers and citizens. What Peter Thiel calls the oxymoron of capitalist democracy is resolved by jettisoning democracy. It's easy for liberals to dismiss Peter Thiel as a comic book villain, but this caricature obscures the fact that Peter Thiel is a sophisticated thinker and a perceptive one. His central observation, that American capitalism is facing a crisis, is unquestionably correct. From 1920 to 1970, real per capita GDP grew by a staggering 2.5% a year on average. From 1970 to 2014, it slowed considerably to 1.7%. And the slowdown in labor productivity has been even starker. Over the long term, stagnation doesn't just threaten capitalism by limiting growth, it also runs the risk of turning people against capitalism, as their wages and living standards deteriorate. This is already happening, as the popularity of Bernie Sanders' campaign made clear. A Trumpist state could do much to soothe the crisis of capitalism. It could pour public dollars into discovering the next lucrative technology for the private sector while holding the line against the redistributive clamor of a rising millennial majority. Basically, it seemed clear to pretty much everybody that Peter Thiel was hoping that Donald Trump would divide America so much that no one would be able to agree on whether or not you should kind of dismantle capitalism in the sense that Peter Thiel wanted it, unrestricted, able to innovate whatever he wants with absolutely no care for the greater good of the common people. And his bet, at least that Trump would be elected, paid off. And not only that, but by investing in Trump at a moment when absolutely nobody else would even stand in a room with the president, Peter Thiel had bought himself an unmatched level of influence thanks to the same foresight he had always had throughout his career. And now, he was going to create a politician from scratch. The same way that he had spent the first half of his career investing in and guiding companies, Thiel had been investing in people for a long time as well. He once famously paid a bunch of undergrads $200,000 each to drop out of college and start their own companies, and it was famously easy for students who contributed to the Stanford Review during their time at Stanford to find work at his companies after graduation. Even more than that, his list of mentees includes huge names like Sam Altman and more. But in 2011, he started out on the journey to create a politician. In the spring of 2011, Peter Thiel gave a talk at Yale Law School where he argued that there was a big bubble forming in America, but it wasn't anything related to business or financial markets. Instead, it was higher education. He would talk about prestigious degrees having little purpose besides to funnel people into unfulfilling bureaucratic jobs that have little to nothing to do with genuine innovation. And one person who attended that talk was J.D. Vance, a 27-year-old former military journalist who was now pursuing a law degree at Yale. The story goes that the speech had such an effect on him that he realized he didn't want to practice law as a career, but instead do something much more impactful with his life. And so a couple years later, after he had practiced law for about a year, J.D. Vance follows in Peter Thiel's footsteps and goes to work in Silicon Valley in venture capital. But even from there, though, he would only grow further. In 2016, he releases a book about his impoverished childhood in Ohio, and the perspective of someone who was both from the poorest part of the country and successful in the world of tech quickly became the subject of national interest.
So you combine all that, the hopelessness, the despair, the cynicism about the future, the childhood trauma, the low social capital, and you begin to understand why me, at the age of 14, was ready to become just another statistic, another kid who failed to beat the odds.
And while his book was often described as an explanation of the Trump phenomenon,
you understand Trump supporters more than most people do, especially the white working class we were talking about, who overwhelmingly voted for him. You also wrote about your and their struggles in your book.
That the so-called coastal media didn't know a whole lot about, and hopefully my book shed a good light on those folks and help people understand why they were struggling and why they were concerned about their futures.
Vance himself would vocally speak out against Trump as a self-described never-Trumper.
I'm a never-Trump guy. I never liked him.
He once said, "Trump is cultural heroin. He makes some people feel better for a bit, but he cannot fix what ails them." He would even say that Trump was leading the white working class to a very dark place, and that he might become America's Hitler if left unchecked.
Trump is a really bad candidate, and frankly, I think a really bad person.
But in 2020, J.D. Vance moved back to his home state of Ohio, far from the career in media and venture capital he had been building for the past decade, but very close to a possible entry into a political career at home. And sure enough, not long after, he announced a run for senator. At that moment, J.D. Vance was probably one of the last people Donald Trump ever would have endorsed. But J.D. Vance wasn't really running alone. He had an advantage that most candidates couldn't even dream of. Because as it turns out, J.D. Vance's career wasn't just inspired by Peter Thiel, in fact, it was paid for by him. The venture capital companies that Vance had worked at after school were Peter Thiel's companies, and J.D. Vance's political campaign was also paid for almost entirely by Peter Thiel, who spent $15 million, more than Vance's entire campaign raised on its own, on a super PAC that ran video ads supporting JD Vance. His only problem was that he had left behind a long track record of detailed critiques of Donald Trump's politics just a couple years before he was trying to get into the Republican Party. But in reality, again, that wasn't really going to be a problem at all. After all, Peter Thiel was Trump's most prominent ally in Silicon Valley and JD Vance's biggest donor. And so with Peter Thiel's money and network clearing the path to get a Trump endorsement after insulting him in years past, it was an obvious choice for a former never-Trumper to rebrand as MAGA. Ultimately, there was no way he was going to win without it. And so Peter Thiel didn't just influence JD Vance's political career, he created it. If JD Vance hadn't been able to get Trump's endorsement, which he got through Peter Thiel, he never would have entered the Senate, and he obviously wouldn't have become vice president less than 2 years later. There's a lot to be said about JD Vance having completely switched his political ideals in exchange for power and influence, but somehow that really isn't even the part that matters. What matters is that Peter Thiel was able to buy his friend a seat just a heartbeat away from the presidency.
He had the support of billionaire Peter Thiel, but that still wasn't enough. The Trump endorsement lifted him out of the pack, put him past Josh Mandel, the conservative state treasurer, State Senator Matt Dolan, who's more moderate on the Republican side, and that cemented the victory for JD Vance.
During an interview with The Atlantic about a year and a half ago, Thiel would reveal that after declining a request for another $10 million campaign donation from Donald Trump, it would only be a few weeks before he heard that Donald Trump had called him a fucking scumbag while on the phone with another politician that Thiel was connected to. And this is something that I think a lot of people don't know. Peter Thiel has been saying for about the last year and a half that he is completely done with politics forever, after being massively disappointed with the Trump administration not being able to reach almost any of their lofty goals. Even after being branded as a conservative kingmaker by the media for helping build support for Donald Trump and ostensibly being the whole reason why JD Vance has a political career at all, he is no longer interested in American democracy, period. It's a strangely quiet and almost disappointing end for a political career that was once kind of blatantly focused on upsetting the order of our political system entirely. But in reality, Peter Thiel's quote-unquote losing interest in politics may not be as much of a disappointed surrender as he makes it seem, because Peter Thiel has essentially already completed his goals that he set out to achieve in terms of making democracy safe for capitalism 15 years ago. The vice president of the US, the top pick to be the next president of America, is one of his closest allies in political philosophy. But even more than that, Palantir has already achieved Peter Thiel's goals of leapfrogging the government entirely by creating a private surveillance state that has access to immensely important information from almost every military and intelligence agency in the Western world. If that isn't the definition of going around the government to seize power for yourself, I don't know what would be. But that also doesn't mean that Peter Thiel is finished with trying to outright replace democracy altogether either, because what Peter Thiel has turned his attention to next is comparatively even crazier than any idea he ever tried to build before. For a couple of years now, Peter Thiel has been traveling around the world to give talks about how he relates Christian themes and concerns to current global events. And his main focus has been the Antichrist, the bringer of end times, and how he sees it manifesting around him. While no video cameras are allowed and attendees have to promise that they'll keep the lectures strictly off the record, one recent series of Antichrist talks that Thiel hosted in San Francisco was particularly publicized and analyzed. Peter Thiel believes that the Armageddon will be ushered in by an Antichrist-type figure who cultivates a fear of existential threats such as climate change, AI, and nuclear war to amass inordinate power. The idea is that this figure will convince people to do everything they can to avoid something like a third world war, including accepting a one world order charged with protecting everyone from the apocalypse that implements a complete restriction of technological progress. In Peter Thiel's mind, this is already happening. He literally says that international financial bodies, stuff that makes it more difficult for people to shelter their wealth in tax havens, are one sign that the Antichrist may be amassing power and hastening Armageddon. He said it's become quite difficult to hide one's money. Basically, Peter Thiel has been arguing that progressive ideas are going to usher in the end of the world, and he has a million arguments to prove it. He often mentions that the basis of this belief comes from none other than Nazi political theorist Carl Schmitt. Sometimes he mentions that he warns other billionaires not to donate their money to charity because of how charity has become a ploy on the part of Antichrist-like figures who seek to take billionaires' fortunes and use it for the advancement of nefarious goals. He says, "I told Elon Musk not to give Bill Gates his fortune." But the one thing that Thiel doesn't address stress in his long, sweaty, rambling speeches is that from another point of view, he himself could also be seen as the Antichrist according to some Christian texts and beliefs. Basically, Peter Thiel argues that stuff like the one world government, charity, and environmental protection are stopping us from moving towards true technological innovation and actually building a better world. But at the same time, he ignores what kind of future will be ushered in by the technology he builds. Peter Thiel has spent decades investing in tools that are used to divide nations and cultures, spy on citizens, funnel money from the bottom to the top, and overall, I would argue that he's helped create a more violent and less stable social order around the world. Peter Thiel and people like him have experienced nothing but wealth beyond imagination, while the rest of the world has suffered and become less stable and prosperous at the same time. And so the problem is that most of Peter Thiel's discussion of the Antichrist is ultimately incoherent. I think what he's doing is trying to create a framework that justifies his own disdain for things that are against his personal financial interest. His positions are pretty clearly anti-humanity. And if you look at it for too long, it starts to look just downright evil. Peter Thiel himself has this personal arc that could be described as Antichrist. In the last 20 years, he went from a libertarian who wanted to make technology that creates freedom. He now believes somehow 2 decades later that democracy is useless and needs to be replaced with monarchy. I think in the end, though, what makes Peter Thiel scary isn't really his ideas, because a lot of the time they just kind of conflict and collapse on themselves. He eventually realizes that he can't necessarily turn the president into a king that will let him spend $100 billion on a floating island in the ocean instead of paying taxes. And so what's really concerning is the man behind these ideas that believes he's on a divine mission to save civilization from itself. Because when you strip away the libertarianism, the authoritarian capitalism, the theology that doesn't really make sense, I think what you find underneath is a very strange human being. There are a lot of reasons why people call Peter Thiel a contrarian. I mean, the name of his biography is literally The Contrarian, because if Peter Thiel's politics sound insane, his personal life is even stranger. There are many other details about Peter Thiel's personal life that make him much harder to understand than any other Silicon Valley billionaire. And I think while these details about his personal life do paint a confusing picture, they also make one thing very clear. Behind all the masks, the concepts, the philosophies, the motives, Peter Thiel is simply a very greedy, self-interested individual who will grab onto any philosophy or idea he can to justify his own evil. He was outed as gay in 2007 by an online tabloid that he would later help push into bankruptcy by funding lawsuits against them. Nowadays, though, he's been married for about 8 years and he has a couple of kids with a husband who spent most of his career working at Blackstone. But even his personal life isn't free of controversy. There's a story from 2023 that involves Peter Thiel's secret relationship with Jeff Thomas that played out in the years prior. Jeff Thomas was essentially an Instagram influencer, and according to tabloids, he and Peter Thiel were in an open secret relationship where Peter Thiel was letting him live in a $10 million mansion in Hollywood, gave him a supercar, and all this great stuff, but at the same time, it was kept completely secret from his husband. It wasn't a typical relationship. Jeff Thomas described himself as being in a kept situation that made him uncomfortable. He said it was stressful. He wanted me to get the nicest car, the nicest house. He wanted to kind of show his power, to show that he had me in a dollhouse. It's not like I was his boyfriend. I was just kind of his friend that was there for him when he needed, for whatever he needed. But Thomas had gone on record in 2022 saying that he was trying to push Thiel away from being involved in the culture war and donating to Republican politicians. He had even said that he was part of the reason why Thiel didn't back Trump during the 2020 election, showing him that it was the wrong thing to do. But early in 2023, some tabloids would report that he had crashed a New Year's party at Peter Thiel's house to confront him and his husband once and for all about Thiel's increasingly aggressive political causes. But then, just a few weeks later, Jeff Thomas was found dead, having fallen from the window of a high-rise apartment building in Brickell, Miami. While his death was investigated as a suicide, it would also become the subject of speculation online after people close to him reported that he wasn't depressed and couldn't have been happier or more normal in the weeks leading up to his passing, with lots of future plans and ideas taking shape. Whether Jeff Thomas's death was an accident, a tragedy, or something darker, what it revealed was that the empire Peter Thiel built stops at nothing in consuming everything around him. Everyone in his orbit eventually becomes a piece of his plans, partners, proteges, even lovers. And that's what kind of makes understanding Peter Thiel pretty difficult, but also not at all. Because behind every ideology, every donation, moral panic, apocalyptic lecture, there's always the same ugly truth. His only goal is control. When you take away the philosophy, the theology, the contrarian mask, what's left isn't a mysterious thinker. It's a man who's so terrified of losing control that he'd rather destroy the world than share it. And that's where Peter Thiel's story stops being personal and becomes universal, because Peter Thiel is a symptom of a society that worships money, power, and control above all else. And that's what brings us to the ultimate question. What happens when those instincts stop belonging to just one billionaire and start defining the entire direction of civilization? I think Peter Thiel and I do agree on one very important thing, that the world as we know it is changing drastically, and it's happening right before our eyes. The systems that prior generations took for granted are being pushed to the brink. Our institutions are crumbling, advertising and surveillance and fake culture wars fill our minds, public trust and belief in the government is at an all-time low, the economy our parents grew up with no longer seems to exist, and the future isn't coming fast enough to feel like we're going to make it out of this alive. It really does feel like the neoliberal, democratic political order has failed. We're not in a golden age of American history by any measurement, maybe except constructing AI data centers. Feels like innovation has been forgotten in favor of consumerism, while the poor get poorer and the rich get richer. But I think where Peter Thiel and I would disagree is the separation of church and state. The separation of church and state is one of the foundations of classical liberalism. This is one of the main tenets of political order that Curtis Yarvin and Nick Land want to get rid of. And maybe it's one that they don't often address, but this is one of the foundations of Western civilization as we know it right now. And whether you're religious or not, which I personally am, I don't think any of us ever want anyone with my beliefs or anyone else's to use those beliefs as the basis for our government. I don't care if it's my personal pastor or my priest or the Pope or Jesus himself. I would not want my spiritual leader to become my political leader. It's the perfect setup for abuse, bias, control, and manipulation. And when you open that door, every law, every policy, and every punishment becomes dangerous. It stops being about what's right, and it becomes about what's right for whoever is in power. And we know what happens after that. History is full of people who were silenced or worse in the name of divine authority. We lost hundreds of years of civilizational progress because of people wielding divine authority as a political weapon. And again, we've known this for centuries. Hundreds of years ago, people sailed across oceans and were imprisoned and even died to live in a world where the government wouldn't determine their religious freedom. In 1802, Thomas Jefferson wrote the letter to the Danbury Baptists, and he said, "Believing with you that religion is a matter which lies solely between man and God, that he owes account to none for his faith or for his worship, that the legitimate powers of government reach actions only and not opinions, I contemplate with sovereign reverence that act of the whole American people which declared that their legislature should make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, thus building a wall of separation between church and state." Let's read that again. He said, "I contemplate with sovereign reverence that act of the whole American people which declared that their legislature should make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, thus building a wall of separation between church and state." For over 200 years now, we have stayed on that course of a separation between church and state as much as we can. And there have been a lot of benefits to living in a secular nation. I think what we're seeing right now makes it pretty clear that even if we remove church, that a lot of people still have the instinct, the desire to be drawn towards belief systems that mirror religion, even if it doesn't involve church in the traditional sense. For many people, that's a puritanical leftist politics. For other people, it's a reactionary desire to return to a bygone past that never existed to begin with. But my point being is that for some people, the all-encompassing God right now is just money, wealth, and capital. Today, the richest 400 people in America have more wealth than the entire bottom 50% of the country. And if you think it would be bad to live in a society where the church decides what you are and aren't allowed to do as a private citizen, you probably shouldn't want to live in a society run by billionaires either. The track record of billionaires, it shows that they don't really care who on earth has to suffer, die, overdose, or God knows what else, as long as they can continue enriching themselves indefinitely. It's pretty hard to argue that our society isn't in decline. I think Peter Thiel and I both agree on that. It's just that his solution seems to involve making it worse for everyone except himself. And the problem with that is that the worship of capital that we're seeing right now is so complete that we've sold our entire society to the highest bidder so they can make themselves richer without caring that it turns the rest of the world into a hopeless slum. Social media was one of the biggest inventions of our century, and right now it's being used to manipulate elections. Devices and algorithms can be used as trackers. Information has been consolidated into the hands of a select few. At this point, social media isn't much more than a tool for division and manipulation. It's been a contributing factor to so many of our contemporary societal issues, and at the same time, the richest people in the world are allowing that, and they continue to allow it for the sake of their own gain. Our social order and our sense of community has practically been destroyed just so a small percentage of men could get rich from it. Even right now, tech CEOs are colluding with Republican politicians to prevent regulation on the AI technology that threatens almost every single corner of the American economy. But it goes even deeper than that. The Rust Belt was once a beautiful center of manufacturing and innovation, and it's been turned into an apocalyptic wasteland for better corporate profit margins. Because for the people that make these decisions, for the people who control capital, money is God and humanity is an afterthought. The abuses, the crimes against humanity, these things that are happening as a result of capitalism as a religion, they're reminiscent of the abuses that the church carried out when it had control over European politics for hundreds of years. We are currently, literally, going backwards so a small group of people can consolidate power over society into their own hands. I feel like the most prolific conversations about what a civic religion looks like usually relate to identity politics. It's pretty much a system of beliefs that comes with a built-in moral law, heresies, this framework for meaning and belonging without God. And I think people love saying this about the trans community and gay people, furries, leftists, communists. If you think that's bad, imagine if the civic religion of greed and millionaires and billionaires became the dominant political player in our country. This country full of people struggling to get by, being run by the same people who created those conditions in the first place, it's kind of already happening. Billionaires are the same people who crashed the housing market in 2008 and only walked away richer than ever, while millions of Americans lost their homes, savings, and dignity. Between 2008 and 2010, there were an extra 20,000 suicides in America. There was a financial crisis that led to 20,000 people dying, while at the same time, billionaires came out richer than ever. Billionaires are the same class of people who sold out high-paying factory jobs to China, leaving middle America looking more like a ghost town than the center of the richest country on earth. If you want to see what a society run by billionaires would look like, go to the south side of Chicago or St. Louis, Missouri, or Baltimore, or Detroit, or Cleveland, or Philly, or Buffalo, or Youngstown, or Milwaukee, or the thousands of small towns where everyday life ceased to exist. That's what it looks like when an entire nation worth of people is cast away and discarded because the people on top figured out they could get the work done more efficiently somewhere else. This is what it looks like when the money starts flowing from the bottom to the top and not the other way around. It's the same thing that's happening with the surveillance and the division brought about by the uncontrolled growth of tech companies in the last decade and a half. The fabric of our society is coming apart at the seams, and beyond a small group of people making billions from it, we have very little to show for what we lost. What I'm trying to say is that, yeah, maybe worshiping democracy hasn't created a perfect world, but I think we also know what it would look like if society started to worship money and wealth above everything else. And I think by all accounts and evidence, it would be much, much worse. And my point in saying all of this is that this is why following the political ideals of a billionaire is outright ridiculous. When you look at the long arc, the 30-year arc of Peter Thiel's career, the basis of his beliefs becomes pretty clear. He starts off as a libertarian technologist that wants to create technological bridges to connect people and ideas in a way that was never possible before the internet. He wanted to build a libertarian future where freedom and liberty were the highest goals of all. At first, he made a platform where anyone in the world could send money to anyone else. It was crypto before crypto existed. After that, he would spend more than a decade investing in every libertarian idea he could find. Facebook, Airbnb, Lyft, SpaceX, all these beautiful companies that aim to connect people and push humanity forward into a more free future for all. But after he became disenchanted in his libertarian goals following the government bailouts in 2008, he would make it his mission to instead take control for himself, even if it meant destroying democracy and representation for the people. He would realize that what they had built wasn't a libertarian utopia at all, but a series of systems that could be used to observe, manipulate, and control humanity worldwide. And suddenly, his libertarian beliefs started to take a back seat to the potential for power that was laid out in front of him. Even as far back as 2004, Peter Thiel wrote that a direct path forward is prevented by America's constitutional machinery. But he said, still though, there are more possibilities for action than first appear. He said, instead of the United Nations, filled with interminable and inconclusive parliamentary debates that resemble Shakespearean tales told by idiots, we should consider the secret coordination of the world's intelligence services as the divisive path to a truly global Pax Americana. This surveillance super system, Thiel wrote, could act as a political framework that operates outside the checks and balances of representative democracy as described in high school textbooks. He didn't like the idea of big government and control over people until he realized that he had become so rich and powerful that maybe he could be the one in control. At that point, he changed his mind. And eventually, Peter Thiel would even go so far as to influence and back an unstable populist president that he believed might help get him closer to total domination so he could focus on innovation, power, and money by any means. But when even that didn't work out how he wanted it to, he instead begins to move on towards painting leftism as a product of Satan, telling the story that only, again, unrestrained capitalism would be enough to save humanity.
Of people, even if you're not related to them, and it's good to act like the Good Samaritan and to take care of people who are not just in your family or tribe or country.
And while Peter Thiel has no doubt put in an immense amount of effort and intellectual power and money to justify what he believes, building on ideas on top of ideas on top of ideas.
But then if you force everyone to be a Good Samaritan and you force a borderless world, it's somehow adjacent. Somehow it's an intensification, but it's somehow also very much the opposite.
When you turn it upside down, you realize that it was never really as complicated as it seems. For all this talk of the Antichrist, the future of humanity, the advancement of freedom and liberty, when you zoom out, it becomes pretty clear that Peter Thiel's guiding motive, above all else, and ever since the beginning, has been money. Every explanation for why his love of money is good for the rest of us is nothing but a way of rationalizing what truly motivates him: greed. Peter Thiel doesn't and never has had a coherent vision of the world. Mostly what he does have is a worship of money so strong that he'll move any mountain to justify it. And his desire to control more and accumulate more eventually changed the core of who he always was in the process of rationalizing the accumulation of more money and power. Peter Thiel would literally rather return to a medieval social order and government than stop accumulating money. He would turn everyone in the world into a peasant just so he can be king. It's not easy to understand who exactly Peter Thiel is, but at the same time, it's not hard either. When you first look at him, there's this web of companies and ideas and philosophies and Lord of the Rings references. He gives lectures on the Antichrist. He references obscure philosophers. He makes himself out to be this intellectual searching for a better way forward. But at the same time, he's not that good at hiding his true motives. He's spent hundreds of millions of dollars enriching himself with investments in military technology. He preaches freedom while building platforms that only serve to increase his control over the world. There was actually a recent interview where he was confronted outright for his hypocrisy and being obsessed with this idea of the leftist Antichrist, while he himself is an investor and builder in weapons of war, killing, and destruction.
It seems to me that when you tell me a story about the Antichrist coming to power and using the fear of technological change to sort of impose order on the world, I feel like that Antichrist would maybe be using the tools that you were building, right? Like, wouldn't the Antichrist be like, great, you know, we're not going to have any more technological progress, but I really like what Palantir has done so far.
And the craziest part of that is that Peter Thiel had no answer for himself. When this interviewer finally confronted him with his hypocrisy, he completely folded. He didn't seem like a mysterious tech genius with philosophies and motives beyond our comprehension. He looked like a man so blinded by greed that he forgot to come up with a good alibi for why he wants to own the entire world.
There are all these different scenarios. I obviously don't think that that's what I'm doing. But again, there are these different gradations of this we can describe, but
after all this entrepreneurship, innovation, the mental effort required to build his empire and his philosophies, he sat there in front of the camera blankly, red-faced, stuttering, and sweating. He was seemingly unable to understand what he was even being asked. And I think that moment gave away what Peter Thiel really is: a greedy, selfish person who wants to own the world and will invent any fantasy he can possibly think of to justify it. But it doesn't really matter what I say theoretically about church and state and right and wrong, because right now, Peter Thiel and people like him are winning. Peter Thiel has 2 of his guys in the White House. The American oligarchs have so much control and influence over our society that in some ways, I'm kind of scared to even publish this video. But again, I think what we can agree with the billionaires about is that a great reckoning of society is coming, and in a lot of ways, it's needed. I completely agree with Peter Thiel that society could be described as stagnant, and that there are existential threats to our civilization and our freedom coming down the road. And maybe you can argue that that change needs to be drastic in order to protect the future of humanity. But categorically, logically, in all ways, to have that reckoning come from the top down in terms of greed, money, and wealth, that will bring nothing but the downfall of humanity, because the men at the top do not serve humanity. They serve the god of money. For them, Wealth is the ultimate end, and we've seen for decades that they'll do anything to get closer and closer. But closer to what? I can't tell you. But neither could they. Because with these kinds of pursuits, there's no end on earth that would satisfy them. There never was, and there never will be. You could say that maybe that itself is the Antichrist. Or you could call it what it is, a lie. A complex, twisted, and disgusting falsehood. A lie that needs to be called out for what it is, loudly, while we still can. I'm Philip, this is Volksgeist, thank you for watching.